We have an incredibly interesting sounding talk now from Amanda Best and Nayara Güércio. Political divide, news, media, and mental health as new boundaries during COVID-19 in Brazil and the US. So just briefly, Amanda Best is a translator and subtitler with an MPhil in literary translation from TCD. And, oh, sorry, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Sorry. In English, an MPhil in literary translation from TCD and a BA in French and English literature from Sonoma State University. Her research interests include media studies, linguistics, literature, writing and journalism, deconstructionism and philosophy. Nayara Güércio is a PhD candidate in translation studies at Trinity College Dublin. She has an MPhil in literary translation from TCD also, and an MA in communication studies, and a BA in social communication media studies from the University of Brasilia. So thank you so much. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
I'll put our presentation up here, and thank you so much for having us. If we've been so far on the perhaps under the surface of the water, we're going to come back up now and sort of skim along at a more general level, we'll say. Let's see, sharing my screen. Can everyone see that?
Okay, now I can see it.
You can see it? Okay. All right, Nayara will start for us.
Okay, I must tell you that there's a little bit of home improvement going on the top floor. So if you hear some banging, that's what it is. So hi, everyone. Thank you for having us. We're pleased to be here. So I'm Nayara and this is Amanda. And today we're going to be talking about political divide, news media, and mental health as new boundaries during the 2020 COVID-19 climate in Brazil and the US. Okay. So first of all, we're going to do a little introduction, then talk about our research question and methodology, our analysis, of course, the results, and then our final thoughts and references. So first of all, this study was motivated by the progress of the 2020 pandemic year in the United States and in Brazil. And this is a subject which has gained recent scholarly attention in our view. And the purpose of our study is a basic exploratory research of media rhetoric in regards to current global events, with an emphasis on the topic of course, mental health and social distancing compliance during the 2020 period. So I'm from Brazil and Amanda is American. So we're not only academically, but also personally interested in this theme, of course, and we lived through the pandemic in our home countries. So we were reading the newspapers as well as trying to study them. And Brazil and the US are two nations who were politically divided throughout 2020. And this divide nature affected the outcome of the pandemic response in both countries. Okay. So political polarity in 2020, both Brazil and the US were prepared for the pandemic, infrastructure-wise, I mean, but didn't respond well to it due to a variety of factors. In the US, specifically, a contributing factor was a decentralized approach in that each state had a different policy and plan of action, resulting in a disjointed response to the pandemic. And Brazil saw a similar development, one could say. Okay. Okay, so most of the information that we have been receiving regarding the pandemic has come, I mean Brazil, has come from the Brazilian Press Consortium, which is a partnership established between media conglomerates to report data on the pandemic in Brazil. It was founded last year in June as a way to sort of circumvent the health ministry's lack of efficiency in disseminating health services information on the pandemic. It is also important to note that Brazil does not have a clear distinction between left and right-leaning media when it comes to major news sources. As in, what I mean is they're not saying, oh, hey, we're left-leaning or right-leaning. This is something that the public sort of understands by reading them. The official separation, let's put it this way, is usually between what is public and what is private. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so the US news media is known for being highly politically divided, which is something that has been documented a lot, in fact. And because of this, we aim to understand how this has affected the dissemination of health information. Also, media literacy and trust in the media is lacking in both Brazil and the US. This means the public has been losing trust in major outlets. Instead, people have been seeking information from alternative and sometimes even unreliable sources, fomenting more and more distrust in mainstream media. So what role then does political bias and the resulting rhetorical approach play in the dissemination of information during a global health crisis? Okay. Okay, so, oh, no, one before.
My bad. There we go.
One before, no? Yes, no? This one I didn't talk about that way.
Okay.
So Fox News and CNN were the two media sources chosen to represent the US, and Carta Capital and Estadão were the two media sources chosen to represent Brazil. Fox News was chosen because it's been widely studied for its divisive rhetoric and is currently facing legal suit over misinformation. And CNN was chosen because it is on one of the three most popular US media sources, along, of course, with Fox News. And it is often presented as opposed politically to Fox News. In Brazil, Estadão was chosen because historically it has been popularly known for leaning politically to the right, and Carta Capital was chosen for the same reason, but of course it leans to the left in the political scale, though neither of them clearly states that on their websites. So we chose written media because it presents a more, in our opinion, neutral ground for assessing rhetoric. That's because written language does not include, let's say, visual mannerisms or facial expressions or tone of voice, etc. We thought it would be easier to analyze them. Okay.
Okay, so that brings us on to our research question. We wanted to look at, this question here. Do the boundaries between mainstream right and left-wing media affect the ways in which the topics of specifically quarantine fatigue and mental health during the 2020 pandemic were presented? And then more broadly, in what ways did the medias in these countries discuss these issues? What kind of language did they use? Kind of rhetorical approaches, argumentative styles, etc. So that's what our research aims to explore. In order to do this, we took a survey of 10 articles from each media source, and we analyzed them using a version of Barden's content analysis theory, which is intended to break down a body of data into smaller units of meaning and of content so that it can be analyzed both qualitatively and quantitatively. We chose to look at individual words as well as how the article is categorized on the media source, and to then assign a coding, a meaning to these individual words using, as you can see here, the rhetorical triangle. We wanted to see which of these argumentative styles might be dominant in a given media source's discussion of these topics. In order to find these articles, we plugged in the search terms you see listed below. In English, these were quarantine fatigue, COVID mental health, and isolation, and Nayara plugged in the Brazilian Portuguese equivalents. We used these to generate articles which were pertinent to these topics and picked a survey of 10 from what the website spat back at us. In terms of our analysis process, we broke it into 4 steps. One at the level of word analysis, one at the level of internal article categorization, how did the media source categorize the article, and then one at the level of the overall article tone, so not individual words, but how all of the words work together. We then assigned a rhetorical score to each of these steps so as to ascertain what the dominant rhetorical style might be at each of these levels. And we use this to generate a total rhetorical score to represent the media source as a whole. So for step 1, units of meaning, these were in order to account for a potential bias from our search criteria, for instance, that the word quarantine would necessarily show up often if quarantine fatigue was the topic at hand. We chose to analyze the terms in sort of three categories. So the word analysis is broken into the three categories you see here and two levels of analysis. Search terms, what we use to generate the articles, and polarizing terms, which we expected to find within the articles because of the nature of the discussion at hand. These were terms we expected to find, so these were analyzed at one level. We then analyzed non-search terms, which showed up often. I'll explain in a little bit how we did this. We believe that these terms have a separate weight because they have a potential to represent, for instance, the journalist's individual choice to use these words frequently. Each word was read in the context of the sentence, and here they are for both media sources, and we'll come back to these, of course. They were read. Oh, there I am. Sorry. Each word was read in the context of the sentence and then assigned a logos, a pathos, or an ethos score point based on a criteria of how the word was used in the sentence. So for instance, here it would be given a logos point if the term was used to describe events, statistics, or proven facts. They would be given a pathos point if it was used for emotional appeal or anecdotal evidence. And finally, an ethos point if it was used to refer to an accredited source of information or policy. So we used a basic point system, and of course, a good argument should have an equal distribution of all three of these. We'll also get back to that. Similarly, and because of that, a word could receive more than 1 point in each category, depending on how often they were used in a given rhetorical approach. And just again, basically outlining that second step, the articles were read as a whole unit of meaning so that we could ascertain themes, identify sources, common argument styles, and sort of look at the article as a whole. How does it come off to the reader as a whole? And again, and finally, that third step, we considered how did the media source categorize the article? How might the media source intend the article to have been read? As a health article, an opinion article, and we anticipated that certain rhetorical styles would be more dominant in certain categories. So we wanted to account for all of that in our point system. So Nayara will present her results first for her analysis of the Brazilian news articles. Nayara.
Thank you, because I muted myself when you were talking and I wasn't able to unmute myself back. Okay, so a few words that seem to be under ethos or logos, for example, that you would think it would be just under ethos or logos, such as president, or under pathos only, such as fear or die, for instance. After the rhetorical analysis, were actually put under other categorizations as well, which got us thinking about meaning in context versus meaning in through dictionary definitions. Okay. So these are the internal article categorization. So Carta Capital had 5 articles under health. Estadão also had 5, opinion 3, 2, politics 1, 1, society 1, 0, and behavior culture none for Carta, and Estadão had 2. Okay. Okay, so it is important to note that not all articles are in fact about mental health, not in Brazil's case. Some of them just mention it or mention other related words such as anxiety or bore-out syndrome, which was thoroughly explored in Estadão. But as for the results, they were not all that different, to be honest. Both seem to have approached the topic of mental health and health in general with care, though Carta seemed to be a little more diverse regarding the themes approached in the articles. Many of Carta's articles were trying to debunk some of the things that people were saying, like you should take this medicine, no, wait for it to be proved scientifically. So spoiler alert, we believe this might explain why Carta Capital had a higher pathos score than Estadão, for instance. Okay. Okay, you can move on. Thank you. So the overall rhetorical score, so we had 80% score under logos for Carta, 62.5 for Estadão, pathos 62.5, 42, ethos 50, and 30 for Estadão. So the most common style actually was, in fact, logos for both news outlets in Brazil. Okay.
And for the US article data, we don't have time, of course, to go over all of these words here, but I wanted to point out that, for instance, and this sort of demonstrates our process a bit, if we look at the word social, it's about halfway down the list on CNN. It was used 21 times in total for CNN, 13 of those times in a logos capacity, versus Fox News, which used it 25 times, 12 of which was in a pathos capacity. So these were the sorts of things we wanted to look at and sort of compare and contrast on the level of the word. The breakdown of those previous terms, they were used 75% of the time by CNN as a logos term, and only 62.5% of the time as a logos term for Fox News. Fox News has a higher pathos score than CNN and a higher ethos score than CNN. However, CNN overall scores highest in logos, and they both have the highest, they both use those terms the most often as logos terms. And this again was these were these words that the journalists chose to use often, but which were not necessarily included in the word bank due to search parameters. So here it's interesting because with these terms, the ones that showed up often circumstantially, Fox News had an equal distribution of logos and pathos usages, whereas CNN still primarily only used logos. This could be due to a number of factors that I'll explain in a slide or two, actually right now. So doing the overall article analysis, excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold. This was a bit more tricky to assign a simple logos, pathos, ethos dominant score because, as we mentioned before, the theory behind the rhetorical triangle is that a good argument encompasses all three of those styles equally. So what I did here instead was focus on sort of the general tone, which is that 11th column down there. And what I found was between CNN and Fox News, the general tone, so this is not counting individual word use, was actually rather similar. They were both relatively informative, somewhat careful, somewhat cautionary, and very banal, very neutral in their approach to these topics. The kinds of articles you would see would be basic health advice, how to keep your diet healthy, how to safely meet with others to maybe go on a walk or something, as well as pieces which would have contributed to a pathos score, and that they talk about anecdote, talking about, how hard it's been in quarantine, missing graduation, missing life events, being sympathetic to the reader in that instance. So overall, what I actually found was that in looking at that banal sort of approach, looking at sort of the general topic of the article, CNN scored high in logos and pathos. If it was within 3 points, I counted it as well, of the highest score. And Fox News had mostly logos. They got 9 articles out of those 10 as at least 1 logos point. This was not what I expected from my studies on Fox News rhetoric. Similarly, the internal article categorization, the media source of the 10 articles surveyed from each source assigns the 6 of them in CNN as health articles and 4 of them in Fox News as health articles. This is the highest scoring category for each article, each media source. And just of note, Fox News has many more opinion articles in that survey than CNN, might contribute to their pathos score, for instance. And their final scores, much like with Nayara, were actually both primarily logos. This is perhaps due to a number of factors, including that, these are journalistic sources. We would expect a somewhat banal tone, but in the end, it seemed we were unable to actually identify a difference in the approach to this topic based on political bias. Both scored highest in logos, all 4 rather. Both right-leaning newspapers were more moderate than we had expected. The Brazilian left-leaning newspaper scored higher in pathos than the American news outlet. This is of note because the relative political sort of distribution of each of these news outlets is it's further left for the left-leaning source in Brazil than it is for the left-leaning source in America. But the right-leaning American news source is further right than the Brazilian right-leaning news source. And when you get, of course, towards the ends of those political spectrums, you tend to radicalize. You tend to get further from facts reporting. And perhaps this may explain why a pathos score would be higher for Fox News or Carta Capital. And finally, all newspapers scored lower in ethos than we had expected. There were far fewer distribution of terms used in a generally citational manner, referring to, for instance, the CDC or Johns Hopkins University. So this was interesting. These were results we had not expected. And Nayara will conclude for us.
So the media sources do not differ largely in overall rhetorical tone and style. This was the same between Brazil and the United States, suggesting that the mainstream media in neither country, though politically biased, presented somewhat similar discussions on the topic of quarantine fatigue and COVID mental health. So we were really surprised and encouraged by our findings, because it's good to know that when it comes to the topic of health or mental health, that it doesn't really matter when it comes to major media outlets, if they're left-leaning or right-leaning, Brazil, America. So it was actually very encouraging to know that it was somewhat the same. Okay.
So some further discussions, excuse me. I just wanted to bring up again something we had noticed while doing our overall tone, our article overall analysis, was we found our rhetorical point system to be a little limiting, because, for instance, a good argument should feature all three of these styles equally, but that doesn't account for misinformation or potentially polarizing rhetoric. It seems in general that the articles have presented a somewhat unified front on how to take care of your mental health. This was encouraging, that this was not different based on the political leaning of the paper. But it's possible that restricting our article analysis to identifying a dominant type of rhetoric, in this way at least, might have the potential to miss the nuance of the rhetorical approaches actually being employed. For instance, many articles appear banal, but could be perceived as scathing or inflammatory when other criteria like word choice is considered. This is something we would tweak in a further development of this study. Yes, that's something I wanted to mention. Nayara?
And we started thinking, had we only examined articles categorized under politics, for example, or under health, how different might the results have been? Would political bias played a larger role then? Maybe yes, maybe no. Had we expanded our search into 2021, how different would these results might have been? We were thinking perhaps they would have been different, because the U.S. had major changes from 20 to 21. They changed the presidential administration. Brazil did not. Would that have made any difference in how how health or the vaccine accelerated a lot in the U.S., but in Brazil it did not? Would that have made any difference regarding political bias? We don't know, but we expect to research that a little further down the road. And I guess that is it.
Yes. Here are our sources, image credits, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Amanda and Nayara, for such very original and really interesting research.